Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 48, which I've entitled The Spiral Mountain Staircase. I wanted to try to speak to a topic I've been wanting to discuss for years, but haven't quite found the ideal words for. And, sad to say, I still haven't found them. But I'm trying not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good quite as often as I have in the past, and to instead just push forward and force out the words. When you think of what makes a capable or dynamic or impactful or potent human being, what is it that you tend to think of first and foremost? Physical health or strength, for example, intelligence and problem-solving ability, or perhaps being psychologically or spiritually well-oriented to the extent that they're able to better discern what truly and deeply matters, relative to what only masquerades as important. All of these things, and likely whatever else you may have thought of as an answer to this question, certainly matter in their own way. But I'd suggest one thing matters more than all of these, and easily, far and away, ranks as the most important and most valuable of gifts a person might possess. And this thing, for lack of a perfect term here, I'm going to call alignment with God, or proximity to the center, or resonance with the center. Height, loftiness of being, proximity to and alignment with the divine. If we picture this divine nature residing at a central point that represents a peak of a mountain, this might be a helpful visual for what I'll be trying to speak to here. How high up one rises is the determining factor as to how much they'll be able to see and take in, how far-sighted they'll be able to be, the breadth and depth of their vision, their ability to glimpse distant horizons, to take in different levels and spheres of life, and compare and contrast them to one another. A person can have all of the other gifts in the world, perfect physical health and immense strength, a sharp and brilliant mind, capabilities of great genius, charisma and social skills, but none of this matters in the least if they don't have what I'm speaking to here. Because what I'm speaking to here acts as the fuel for all other spheres, and for all other efforts across an individual's life. We all know the feeling of being drained or exhausted, that complete lack of energy and motivation, that both causes demoralization and depression, but also arises from these things in a vicious cycle that can quickly grow exponentially worse if left unchecked. The type of state of being I'm attempting to speak to here is the opposite of this drained exhaustion. And, in fact, in its ideal form, it's such a potent form of energy that it can almost feel overwhelming. In this state, even the most dull and incompetent individual can find a way to accomplish great things, and in fact will be so motivated and compelled that they can't help but move towards doing so, however that might manifest. They'll seek and strive and put in the work until it comes to fruition, and do so almost effortlessly, as if compelled by an all-powerful force above and beyond themselves. This state of being might sound largely foreign to most of us, and understandably so. It's the epitome of the exceptional and rare, and the difficult to achieve, especially in our age. In this modern environment in which we're so consistently in reptile brain mode, because we're so dominated by fears and anger, hatred and suspicion, locked within sickly and chaotic and collapsing nations. Because we're so adaptive to our surroundings, because both mind and body adjust to best process and interpret whatever challenges or obstacles or tasks we face on a day-to-day basis, we are also capable of growing incredibly dense if we're not careful. It's a process of putting blinders on to shield ourselves from this immense, incalculable, and unfathomable complexity and depth and breadth of our existence. To ignore all of this, to instead laser focus on the utilitarian, to ensure we keep ourselves fed and clothed, keep our temperature regulated and our bodies safe from all types of threats. In modern times, we've been able to solve many of these problems to the degree that they aren't constant conscious concerns anymore, which would seem to be great news, and seemingly open the door to what many great thinkers called otium, or a type of peace of mind in which we aren't focused to think down purely utilitarian paths, and constantly about immediate concerns or pressing dangers. But this news doesn't seem quite as great on closer inspection, considering that the vast majority of us now fill this extra time with the most mindless and fruitless distractions. For the most part, we're rarely pondering the nature of being, or the nature of God, or why we're here, what our origins are, what our purpose is. These are massive, difficult, daunting questions, after all. And we're surrounded by a minefield of contradictory or confusing answers. And in many cases, with these answers coming from sources we're not sure we have legitimate reason to trust. So it's much easier to simply focus elsewhere. And so we practice a multitude of forms of escapism and lighthearted entertainment, which now range from obsessive social media usage to gaming, TV and movies, televised sport, the creation and exploration of all manners of digital and virtual worlds. And it'd be unfair to simply write all of this off as purely net negative. After all, we really do need some entertainment. We need to find ways to laugh, de-stress, enjoy ourselves, and have fun. The problem here is that so many of us now move from work mode, in which our brain is largely on autopilot and simply focused on getting a job done and or getting home, and then into play mode, in which, again, our brain goes on something like a different form of autopilot, while we seek to blow off steam, from autopilot to autopilot. After years of this, our brain adjusts and adapts. I'd suggest certain pathways even begin to atrophy, and it becomes, to an ever greater degree, like a machine, operating strictly within defined boundaries, rarely straying from these narrow paths, and, in fact, eventually taking these narrow paths to be just about the sum total of life and all existence. And this is a terrible development. To use an extreme example to try to better illustrate the point, picture a man working at a factory, building some technological widget. All day at work, his head is down, his focus on assembling the pieces. He goes home, and to de-stress, again with his head down, he plays games or watches programs on this same technological widget. And this cycle is repeated, day in, day out. Above his head stretches a gorgeous and mysterious starry sky with countless points of beautiful light. A bright and radiant moon reflecting light back to Earth from a potent and fiery sun that, almost as if by magic, allows all life itself to flourish. Within his body are countless billions of cells working every single second to keep his body functioning. He's unconsciously master and general over his organs, his limbs, his beating heart, and the brain that allows him to process all sensory inputs. He's surrounded by billions of other beings of great complexity, each with their own story, their own thoughts and feelings and life experiences, and an endless variety of plant and animal life, microorganisms everywhere, including in every breath he takes. And with all of this intimately connected in an intricately weaved lattice-like structure in which the butterfly effect of any seemingly small and inconsequential action or of some new idea might, at any moment, create a cascading effect that gradually begins to change everything around him. But he's essentially become blind to all of this, and so much more in kind. He has blinders on, and his life experience represents the most narrow sliver of this totality. And, in fact, if he were to try to suddenly take in or fully process this totality, if he could somehow suddenly glimpse the interconnectedness and interwoven nature of all things, to truly see it, not in some dry academic sense, but from the highest perspective of a great sage or poet or genius who spent a lifetime contemplating such things, it would probably completely overwhelm, even paralyze, and almost certainly confuse. So, while we're unique among all species, and that we have this gift of consciousness, most of us have taken to sprinting away from this highest of all gifts, and instead embracing this dense narrowness, which we've convinced ourselves is easier and more comfortable. We seem to take the fact that we now play with phone apps, as opposed to plowing fields or raising cattle, as some powerful step forward into progress. But I'd contend that these actually become very similar habits, and that they're both relatively mindless, repetitive, with simple and direct rewards, with the only deeply significant difference being that one yielded clear and tangible real-world benefits, and the other only virtual gains. It's so easy to fall into these narrow paths and this increasingly dense mindset that helps us forget our true nature, our place in the world, its vastness and complexity and interworkings. And we can't entirely be blamed for this. There's real comfort in the simple and habitual, and in not straying down paths that we're not sure we can understand or navigate properly. But there's also great and life-affirming magic here, in being able to even catch some hint or echo of the grander design. Speaking very personally for a moment, I was blessed with an experience growing up that I don't think I've ever mentioned to anyone, and possibly won't ever again. Not just because it's highly personal, but far more importantly because I couldn't possibly do it justice with mere words. And so I won't try to use many, and I'll keep it simple. I was probably 5 or 6. I remember waiting for my brother to get home from school. I remember the most simple things and the most simple setting. The green grass, the gentle rustling of the trees, the bright sun shining through them. A very pleasant day. But nearly every day was pleasant at these ages, so there was nothing unique about this in itself. But suddenly, I had an experience, like a flash. Time seemed to both stand completely still in some sense, and yet seemingly speed up to near infinity in another. Again, words completely fail here. The only way I can describe it with confidence is this. If you picture a seismograph needle or a heart monitor, and its rhythmic moving up and down in a consistent and reliable pattern, marking a relatively consistent high point and low point with each major sweep. If we took these sweeps to represent my total range of life experience, picture it suddenly extending outward in both directions into territory 100-fold greater than the usual range, again like a seismograph in an earthquake. It felt as if I'd caught a glimpse of something not consciously understood and yet still grasped on some level, and something far, far more important than anything else I'd seen or experienced in my life. Something that helped put all other life experience into new and clearer perspective. Speaking about it any more than this would feel like cheapening or misrepresenting whatever it was that happened to me at that moment, which, for all I know, may have lasted a millisecond or a half hour. But from that point on, my perspective was different. Life felt different. And though I'd always loved life and been a very happy youngster, everything felt vastly more potent, rich, meaningful, and comfortable. And I was left with the most powerful notion that ultimately everything was good. That no matter what happened, no matter what twists and turns I might face throughout this life or beyond, or that anyone else might, or that the world or universe might. The force that governed and ordered all was this highest good. For those of you that have taken in accounts of near-death experiences and their stories of their experience of a beyond, you'll frequently hear this idea, or something similar. Many are changed forever, and gifted with the most firm and bedrock and unshakable understanding that there's ultimately nothing to fear, that we tend to create our own hells, but that these are ultimately illusory, and the products of compounded error and misapprehension, combined with powerful imagination. You'll also hear a great many of them speak of the experience as if it were far more real than this current reality we all seem to be navigating. As if that glimpse into the beyond was the genuine glimpse beyond this veil of illusion, and our day-to-day lives are somehow firmly within such a veil. I certainly felt this, and there was no doubt in my mind that whatever I experienced was the most real experience I'd ever had, to the extent that the day-to-day reality suddenly felt a bit like a silly joke, albeit a pleasant one, because again, I was quite the happy little camper at that age, but still, that this reality was something like a low-grade projection that couldn't begin to do this absolute reality any justice. I can't say I perfectly retained this memory and this knowledge and the thought and idea of this experience at the forefront of my mind. I'd still go through periods of forgetfulness, but it always remained, at the very least, in the back of my mind as the most heavily formative experience. A simple moment, an unexplainable flash, but it changed everything. It was only later in life that I started to, in a sense, try to find my way back there. I'm reminded of the Hansel and Gretel trail of breadcrumbs to ensure they found their way back home. I spent many years following this trail and essentially training myself to do so. And to make this a bit less vague or abstract and bring it down to earth, I'll try to explain what I mean by this. I mentioned that this experience seemed to leave me with a massively widened spectrum of possibility or potentiality. It's as if it forcibly broke down the walls responsible for confining me to a narrow range of life experience, and confining the spectrum of my thinking and being. And this allowed me to start painting a contrast between the two. For example, the reptile brain ho-hum daily existence of repetitive and mindless behaviors and simple utilitarian necessity, and this almost infinitely loftier point and state of mind or state of being, in which a vastly broader picture and perspective came into view, in which the puzzle pieces representing the largest questions in life suddenly fit together and things made sense for the first time, and in which it was effortlessly easy to feel a love for and connection to that best part of all living creation. In short, every single aspect of this mode of thinking and being, and this mindset, was objectively better and more powerful and energetic in every conceivable way. Thoughts came with far more clarity, and in fact, truth simply seemed to flow, again to a degree that was almost overwhelming. It's a feeling of a great influx of energy. It effortlessly seems to grant one a unique sort of humility, magnanimity, depth, and breadth, and effortlessly allows for the soaring above the mundane and trivial, and draining and exhausting. Life takes on a completely different shape. So, because I was able to contrast the one mental or spiritual state with the other, over the years I felt like I was able to begin to consciously and purposefully walk at least a few steps of the path from the one to the other, and increasingly spend more and more time nearer to the superior end of this spectrum. I'd gradually find certain things that helped me get there: nature, solitude, a certain tune or piece of music or ancient work of literature, And at the same time, I started taking mental note of those things that most frequently acted as anchors and weights, dragging me down, basically barring the way to this higher state. Things you might expect: pettiness, spite, ugliness, crudeness, and degeneracy. Television commercials, to give one example, felt like concentrated poison. So gradually, embracing those things that helped me ascend those steps, and consciously rejecting those things that seemed to pull me down them, everything began to change in positive ways. It might even be fair to say that much of my life, since that moment in my childhood, has been spent not just trying to return, but increasingly trying to consciously chart that course, to ensure I can always find my way back, and ideally remain there as long as is possible. Just a moment or two in that lofty place felt easily worth years of life outside of it. And in fact, I'm convinced that it truly is, objectively so. I mention this all not just to tell a story, but far more importantly, to suggest that there are what might be called levels to our state of being, our manner of thinking, and our life experience, that range from what one might also call hell up to something one might call almost like a glimpse of heaven. Defining these to perfection would be impossible, and is far, far too big and important a task for me to dare to attempt in any systematic and clearly defined way. But very broadly speaking, at the bottom of this staircase is the self-imposed prison of nihilism, hopelessness, despair, weakness, impotence, the belief that all of life is some cheap and petty and ignoble struggle amongst the equivalent of rats on a sinking ship, all struggling to get what they can while they can, and that there's seemingly no rhyme or reason behind it all. You expect the worst from people, and end up very often getting the worst. Everywhere you create self-fulfilling prophecy, filled with depression, doom, and gloom, and finally, so surrounded by and swimming in such heaviness and gravity, you yourself can't help but turn into a weight that drags others, especially the more sympathetic and those who most love and care for you. You've trained your eyes to see darkness everywhere. If it's there, you'll find it. Even if it isn't, your mind will creatively fill in the gaps until it is. But as you climb the rungs of this ladder, or ascend the steps of this staircase, you start to see just how much of this darkness represents your own judgment error, misapprehension and misunderstanding, and faulty perception. How many of these ghastly figures of darkness are your own creations? How much of this insecurity and anxiety is built atop the most faulty premises, and how this frequently hellish prison is one of your own creation. You start to glimpse just how much of the brokenness and pain and suffering of others is caused by similar compounded error and misapprehension, and how this isn't the natural state of things. There is no mass depression or neuroticism in nature, especially in its organic and unmanipulated state. We usher in these things through an almost sacrilegious misuse of our gifts of imagination and consciousness. We are the cause of the disjointed and disoriented nature because we so rarely understand what's best and how to best attain it. So we become like a sick patient, running from prescription to prescription, each created to supposedly treat symptoms, but all the while leaving the root cause essentially untouched, and each seemingly making things a bit worse in the long run, as our maladies are ministered to by every variety of power-seeking hucksters and charlatans, and as we spiral out into needless complexity. As you climb still further, you cease being overly technical and reductionist in mindset. You cease the habit of breaking everything into pieces, and instead seek out the broader picture. A work of art, after all, couldn't possibly be understood by analyzing each individual brushstroke in isolation, but only by pulling back to view the totality. In a very real sense, you began to see the whole world in yourself, and yourself in the whole world. It becomes easier to understand how people stray in this direction or that, because you're able to discern that unique path they seem to have walked somewhere deep within yourself, and how even you might have followed in those same steps had a few things in your life been different. And you're able to feel a thankfulness for dodging that bullet, and a greater degree of empathy for the lost. Climbing ever further, you begin to see beauty more and more often, in place of the darkness and ugliness that once so surrounded you. You train your eyes to see light everywhere. If it's there, you'll find it, and even if it isn't, your mind will creatively fill in the gaps until it is. And you may even be a primary cause of its being created. Instead of being an anchor and a weight and a dark cloud to those around you, you slowly become the opposite. Instead of draining their energy, you become a source providing it. You begin to move from pure irreverence, the mockery and belittlement and tearing down of all things, to reverence for all that's most deserving of being revered. And you actively seek out beauty and seek to create beauty in whatever sphere you're able, from the tangible to the intangible. You begin to see how beauty is practically synonymous with health and order, ratio and proportion and symmetry and balance, and that you're able to increasingly manifest these things, internally and externally, more and more often and more effectively. Climbing still further, you begin to glimpse that we're all creators, whether we like it or not, whether we care to be or not, and that the difference is that some of us come to recognize and be fully cognizant of this role and its power and effects, and that our ultimate goal is and needs to be to create well. Our thoughts create ideas, our words create moods or mindsets or opinions, or create or diminish energy. Our hands can create physical objects, structures, and craft settings and environments. The union of male and female creates new life. Every waking moment, we are somehow participating in this act of creation. Our every thought, every word, every action represents a seed that will later grow to impact the entirety of this lattice-like interconnected structure. Much like that ancient Celtic art with complex interweaving and interconnected patterns. When we slightly push on one or tug on another, the whole or entirety is affected, however slightly, because all is connected. It becomes increasingly clear as to how and why you matter, how you might matter in a net positive way, how you might always choose the path of strengthening and revitalizing and healing at every fork in the road or crossroads of healing or harm, or how you might provide right order at every crossroads of order and chaos. You slowly but surely begin to find your inner wellspring, learning to find all you most need from the inside, as opposed to constantly seeking it and needing it from external sources. And you're able to begin reorienting your internal world, to begin to allow that wellspring to freely flow, unabated, and to keep your window clean, as it were, to allow light to shine through from above. And as you near the highest point that you're able to glimpse, you're filled with an indescribable love and a desire to somehow share all of this with others. And yet, as you reach the highest point, all words and all actions seem superfluous, pointless, silly, cheap, filled with error, a game that perhaps needn't even be played. Silence is the only thing that feels pure and truly makes sense. And so, perhaps you take one small step down again, because, like Arjuna on the battlefield, commanded not to give in to passivity or inaction, but to fight, because we have an active role to play. But you never forget that higher tier, especially in those moments of great chaos, in which you're surrounded by dark delusions and drowning in your own self-created hell. A simple remembrance of this highest tier has the power to immediately chase all of those phantoms away. This spectrum, or this staircase, or the range from the base of this mountain to its topmost point, is the cleanest definition of the difference between a dull and listless life and one filled with richness and depth and meaning. I fully understand how and why a great many of us are relatively locked on the one side, unable to even envision those highest stairs, those higher levels, or even their possibility. But it's all there for us, waiting patiently, until we someday cultivate the senses necessary to take it all in. The eyes to see, the ears to hear. And as the world gets so incredibly ugly all around us, especially on its most superficial layers, this is a task that's much easier said than done. All I'm trying hard to communicate here is that it's so incredibly worthwhile to try. And there are costs, of course, as there are in the pursuit of anything of value. For example, in the realm of being careful what you wish for, I really have consciously worked for a good chunk of my life on attempts to hone my judgment and discernment, and it's a constant and never-ending work in progress. But I also know I've made immense strides over time. However, for those that take this path, if you're not incredibly careful and you don't simultaneously try to refine your ability to feel love, sympathy, empathy, and your ability to have some very real patience, you risk becoming an overly critical and insufferably difficult person. I've certainly experienced this in my own life. I feel like I can be insufferably critical at times, and I'm certainly not just difficult with regard to others, although I like to think that this is at least partially tempered by civility and love. But I'm especially difficult with regard to myself. This has an upside and a downside, of course. The upside of being able to slowly but surely improve, ideally in the most important and fundamental and meaningful ways, to the extent that you're really able to honestly appraise yourself and act accordingly. But the downside is mercilessly beating yourself to a pulp at every turn, if you're not able to practice some degree of patience with yourself. The balance I try to strike just involves frequent reminders that I'm flawed, and that this is a process, and sometimes reminders of that highest tier in that staircase or mountain, the one that allows a person to lightheartedly laugh at anything and everything, in recognition that on the level of the totality of the forest, as opposed to the mere trees, all is well and will be well. And all I'm tasked to do is to learn and do what I can when I can, according to whatever ability I've been blessed with. Nothing more. And I certainly don't want to pretend that now that I've developed some rough idea of this path, that I'm comfortably sitting atop this staircase or mountain at any and every moment. Absolutely not. None of this is even remotely easy, and I certainly stumble a fair bit. What I try to do, the balance I try to strike, is this. When I have energy, I attempt to transmute or manifest it into something energizing for the benefit of other like minds or like souls. And when I'm lacking this energy, I search, hoping to find some others who have done the same across time. And sometimes this other is even a past version of myself. I'll stumble across some notes I jotted down years ago, or some stray recording or audio file, or some memory buried in my subconscious. And it's almost a tangible feeling of that energy flowing back in. And again, pardon my repeating myself, but we really do create our own hell. And I have no patience for those who have made such an art of this, and who seek to spread this disease, albeit almost always unintentionally and unconsciously. Many have even taken on this insidious mindset that all of life is cheapness and pettiness and darkness, and have defined education as almost equivalent to the learning of and dwelling in these dark arts. Think of that lost type who watch the most gory or brutal or depressing video clips, often thinking to themselves, This is real life, and those who shield themselves from it are being ignorant. I feel some sympathy because I've been in a similar place and I know the world they inhabit, and I even feel like I have some understanding of the false paths that have likely led them there, roughly speaking. But I also feel this is one of those instances in life where sympathy or empathy that breeds toleration can do far more harm than good. For example, I can't tell you how much I despise that common conceptual association of intelligence with depression. Not only is it largely inaccurate, at the very least as far as wisdom and genius go, which are far less associated with sad sacky nihilistic faggotry, but it also helps create a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've witnessed circles of people begin to so freely associate the two, and to such an extreme degree, that a depressed person is automatically presumed intelligent, and an intelligent person presumed to be depressed. Not only this, but people begin to lazily draw the natural conclusion from this root-level misunderstanding that the more one understands life, the more dark their inevitable perspective. I assure you, and I'm not completely certain about many things in life, but I'm certain about this. I assure you that this is a complete misread of reality, of life itself, and an abysmal failure of judgment and discernment. As real as it might feel, after studiously creating an intellectual case as to why all is darkness and sadness and misery, this is a blunder. Finding happiness, contentment, fulfillment, and purpose in life is a problem to be solved. Intelligence, at its most pure and fundamental, is problem-solving ability. This sounds harsh, but I believe it's also an incredibly important truth. By not being able to solve this problem, one is simply signaling their lack of problem-solving ability, their lack of the most pure and important form of intelligence. There are scores of good people who fall into these ranks, myself included, perhaps, at my lowest moments. And I don't mean to blame them or insult them, but my contention here is that not only are they completely wrong, but that this is one of those myths that, to the extent that it takes hold in public consciousness, begins to drag all of human existence down to the depths. We give oxygen to such mindsets and such ideas and thought frameworks at our own great peril. It's a very modern conception, too. In most prior ages, especially within healthier nations and living environments, almost all highly positive traits seemed indirectly associated with greater happiness or fulfillment, very much including intelligence or even educational attainment. After all, the more we truly understand our existence, the more we're able to feel like we've come close to answering the largest and most important questions in life. The less we have reason to feel insecurity or uncertainty or anxiety, or those types of baseless superstitions that cause us to see phantoms or dark forces around every corner. I'm reminded of Dostoevsky as a prisoner, kneeling down, ready to take a bullet to his head. And all he could think about at that moment was how incredibly, painfully beautiful life was. How much of this he'd somehow missed before. And that if he were gifted just a bit more time, he'd savor every moment and feel immense gratitude. Granted a reprieve at what was literally the last possible moment to do so, he went on to produce some of the greatest works in history, and did so with a heart full of thankful gratitude and a unique and exceptional wisdom, and the knowledge that life, as bad as it may rightfully look to our subjective eye at any given moment, is, at its core, a great gift. A gift that becomes what we choose to make of it. And before we move from this point, I'd like to clarify to be certain I'm not misunderstood. When I take issue with intelligence being associated with depression, some of you might be thinking of the term ignorance is bliss, and thinking of all those who, for example, are blissfully unaware of various political, cultural, racial or national realities, various conspiracies, and all manners of nefarious happenings that they don't fully grasp or understand. And I'd certainly grant that this type feels far less of the weight of the world on their shoulders and less of a particular kind of stress and anxiety that results. So in this very surface layer or political sense, it might seem valid and logical that a greater understanding only leads to greater difficulties or greater depression. But I'm asking you to pull back this perspective a bit and consider that the greatest understanding I'm attempting to refer to is so far beyond the realm of these temporary challenges we face. I'd suggest there was a reason Jesus was spoken of as serene of countenance, why the Buddha is always pictured with a slight smile. From the highest perspective, after having trod much further down these paths of wisdom and understanding, a certain form of knowledge becomes bliss. This blissful ignorance is extremely temporary and of the type that cattle might feel just before the slaughter. And I'd suggest that as we speak, many of these profoundly ignorant types are beginning to subconsciously recognize those sounds of slaughter in the distance, coming ever nearer, beginning to recognize that something is amiss. This type of ignorance never produces a lasting, and certainly not a deeply rooted, bliss. Foolishness has an extremely low ceiling, whereas a fundamental understanding of these deeper matters opens the door to and allows for the possibility of the attainment of a much more profound and real and lasting bliss, if we care to call it that. We certainly have the most immense challenges in front of us, the most steeply uphill battles, the greatest obstacles. But how exactly we choose to process all of this is ultimately up to us. We can't delude ourselves, of course. This ends up doing far more harm than good. Instead, we're called upon to discover the most stable and healthy and eternally energizing frameworks and perspectives, which, simultaneously, are also fundamentally true, through which we might process our reality. I'm reminded of the stories of the ancient Celts, to give another example. Whereas we moderns have come to view all warfare and battle and death as the most gray, bleak, sad, hopeless, and fundamentally terrible thing that might happen to an individual or a people, several ancient accounts speak of the majority of Celtic peoples going off to fight with a genuine smile. Quote, "They feared nothing, these brave men. They sang as they marched to battle, and perhaps to death. They shot arrows at the heavens when it thundered. They laughed as they saw their own hearts' blood gushing forth. And yet they were plain and simple in their manners, open and generous, docile and grateful, strangers to low cunning and deceit, so hospitable that they hailed the arrival of each fresh guest with joy and festivities, so warm-hearted that they were never more pleased than when they could bestow a kindness." End quote. Treating life as a joke as they did so. In other words, finding a way to kill that nihilistic gravity that produces endless unnecessary tears and sadness. A battle was culturally framed by such men as a great challenge of one's mettle. It was the greatest and highest sport. There was a clear and straightforward goal. There was excitement and adrenaline. There was the mysterious role of fate layered atop that role played by merit and discipline and training and quality leadership. It was the greatest possible show, the most profound and impactful event, and they seemed to relish in it. We get to choose how we frame the events in our lives. The caveat here is that we must be truthful, because if we know we're purposefully deluding ourselves, the resulting purely superficial peace of mind won't be a genuine one. But it's absolutely possible to gain an in-depth understanding of life to the extent that you can take on this lighthearted nature. Not necessarily flippant, certainly not superficial or dense, but simply a recognition that at the end of the day, when the dust settles and all is said and done, that all is well, and all is in the hands of an ultimately just and loving and creative force, part and parcel of a fundamentally balanced universe. We only need to play our individual roles to the best of our ability, and nothing more. One of the things I'm most thankful for, perhaps in part as an outgrowth of that experience in my youth, is this. When the eternal pessimist or nihilist burns away the detritus in his mind, I suspect he's essentially left with darkness, blackness, bleakness, emptiness, perhaps even some anger or depression. I'm beyond thankful that my process is the reverse. I burn away the garbage, and I'm left only with immense, indescribable love. And yet, I'm certainly not there at the top of that staircase or that mountain nearly as often as I feel like I should be or could be. It's a process and a struggle. One of the ways in which it's a struggle is this. I'm someone who so often feels compelled to speak harshly, negatively, or critically, but hates to speak harshly, negatively, or critically. And this is a question I've struggled with finding the best answers to for much of my life, and continue to. I'd suggest one of the biggest divides between the traditionally Eastern philosophical wisdom or spiritual conceptions and those of the West is that the precepts of Western mankind tend to push us toward fruitful action. Jesus said, "Think not that I come to bring peace, but a sword." And again, Arjuna on the battlefield comes to mind in this story so obviously pulled from an Aryan tradition, and his being prompted to fight. We're here for a reason, and to the extent that we recognize and embrace this, it necessitates some degree of action, to active judgment and discernment, the active taking of stances and positions, and being willing to defend all that's highest, as opposed to the more Eastern conception of seeking the void and nothingness. I've always felt there's immense value beyond words, of finding that state of mind and being in which actions and words become wholly unnecessary and feel silly, small, and absurd. But we do currently exist on this material plane, of course, with the ability to influence it, and in my view, a powerful responsibility to ensure this influence is net positive. I've always found it fascinating how virtually every people's stories and myths with regard to the beyond involve them being judged, weighed, or measured. The Christian concept of a God who knows our heart, or the separation of the wheat from the tares, the Valhalla concept of embracing the courageous and heroic, the Egyptian conception of weighing one's heart on a set of scales against a feather, the always fascinating Tibetan Book of the Dead that seemingly involves one's being confronted or tempted by the highest temptations of each individual archetype to determine if our heart or our inner eye is well-oriented enough to resist temptation and bypass them all, and instead seek only the one true God in purest form. Every last one of these ideas of what death holds in store involves some measure of who we were, and to some degree how we chose to spend our time and develop ourselves in this mortal shell, and how much upward progress we were able to make in the process. I think we dismiss all of these at our own peril and at great cost. That said, I do feel like I express anger more often than I should, and overly critical takes, perhaps unduly harsh criticisms, etc. Striking the ideal, artful balance here is incredibly difficult, and we can only do as well as we're able, according to our constitution and orientation at any given moment. Looking around, especially with the present state of the world, we're all going to feel anger and even hatred at times. I feel it's absolutely crucial to learn to balance this out and find reasons to love and ways to find moments of happiness and contentment. Else it'll gradually drain you completely and threatens to turn you into an unbearable person. The ideal here seems to be that of the happy warrior, serving something greater than himself and learning to do so with some stoic wisdom. Hypersensitivity not to the doom and gloom and darkness, but to the beauty and the light, and the moments of resonance with something immeasurably higher. And I think that's it for now. I had much more written here, but I'd like to keep these under an hour, so perhaps I'll do a part 2 in the very near future, if I feel there's a demand for it. I hope some of this made sense and resonated on some level. And I hope you're all well, and thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my